1MDB is one of the biggest frauds, financial frauds in history.
We woke up one morning in July 2015 to realize that almost $700 million had gone into the Prime Minister's account.
The disappearance of billions of dollars from Malaysia's state fund is one of the biggest financial scandals, not just in Malaysia, but around the world.
Of the $8 billion that 1MDB raised via bond sales, it's alleged more than half was stolen.
That's different from a stock fraud or pumping up a stock and then cashing out on your options. This is actual theft of money. 1MDB in Malaysia had been actually some kind of a piggy bank for various, players.
The stolen money went to buy a private jet, luxury real estate, artworks by Picasso and Monet, as well as jewelry for Mr. Najib's wife.
Up to 300,000 taking to the streets calling for Najib's head.
They are fed up with a government that they believe is chronically corrupt.
The projects that were developed by 1MDB were sold as development projects that would be benefit of everyone, but it was later realized that it cost the country probably more than it helped.
This was a cash grab by a handful of people who had put themselves in the position to make themselves rich.
It was a betrayal of the people on a grand scheme.
I arrived at the 1MDB expose through a sort of process of having started to report on the consequences of Malaysian corruption on the ground that was the destruction of the Borneo rainforest. As I looked into it, was plainly caused by political corruption. There was no logical or sensible reason, if you were governing the country for the benefit of the democratic electorate, that you would just rip out a jungle. That was done for pure profit for a handful of decision makers. So I started looking at that story because it was an enormous story with huge global ramifications.
British journalist Claire Rucastle-Brown grew up in the Malaysian state of Sarawak. In 2010, she set up the Sarawak Report to expose corruption in the country of her birth.
I found that I could reach the public in Malaysia and get through what had been a very oppressive media environment to actually get information to ordinary people in Malaysia about how their country was being run. 1MDB was presented by Najib Razak, the new Prime Minister, as a wonderful opportunity. He was going to raise huge sums of money for this so-called sovereign wealth fund to invest. He was also the finance minister, of course, as well as the Prime Minister, so he would be investing the money in all sorts of money-making activities that would then be, beneficial to Malaysians in need of development. But all that money was disappearing. There was no accountability. And by the time I looked at it, we're talking about 2014, there had been 5 years of massive fundraising and then total black hole as far as where that money had gone. I think we were talking about an $11 billion deficit, unaccounted deficit by 2014. There were certain characters associated with the fund who were also dabbling in my area of interest, which was the rainforest state of Sarawak, particularly a young Chinese advisor to the fund and to the Prime Minister named Joe Low. Joe Low in particular had been gaining an international reputation for himself as a massive spender, catching the headlines in New York, Las Vegas, and indeed Hollywood. He was creating a stir. He was the highest spender in all the top nightclubs, and yet had no explanation really for his wealth.
As a lot of you in this room know, I like to plan my evenings and make sure that I always go to the best parties.
So those of us who were looking at this from Malaysia were wondering whether his advisory role at 1MDB, where all these billions were not being accounted for, might be connected to this acquisition of extraordinary wealth by a 26-year-old who'd come from nowhere. I first got my teeth into this story with the launch of a major $100 million Hollywood movie, Wolf of Wall Street, which is all about a bunch of crooks who'd stolen money and were spending it.
The real question is this: was all this legal? Absolutely not.
Which is exactly what the funders of the movie were doing, of course, through 1MDB. Because I was able to join some dots and I realised that the Malaysian money funding this film more than likely came from this fund, because the producer of the movie was none other than the son of the Malaysian Prime Minister, who was in control of the fund, which is losing all this money.
Wow, this is an incredible, incredible honor.
Riza Aziz and Jolo even got a shout out at the Golden Globes.
Thank Joey, Riz, and Joe. Thank you for being not only collaborators, but taking a risk on this movie.
So the 1MDB scandal could not have happened on just a localized basis. It was necessary for the ringleader, the alleged, an accused ringleader of this, Jolo, to find accomplices and people that he could deal with in other countries around the world. As you look back and unwind the development of 1MDB and who the early partners were, there was clearly a certain amount of collusion from interested parties in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
The PetroSaudi data, which was passed to me by a whistleblower, a former director of the company, it showed the internal workings behind the original setting up of the first joint venture of 1MDB with this Saudi shell company that was purporting to be an oil company right at the start of this extended scandal. You see the emails which show a bunch of young men agreeing to pull off this scam. But at the end of the letter they said, of course, we would also be willing to act as a front if that would be useful for some of your operations. So it was all there, along with the data that showed the transfers of money. The initial deal, the PetroSaudi bond deal and joint venture, siphoned nearly $2 billion out of the fund. That was the first information I got hard data on.
Jolo has been charged in the United States with being basically the ringleader of this fraud, the guy who orchestrated it, even though he had no title within 1MDB. I've been asked whether or not he's like a brilliant guy or a criminal genius. I don't think so. It's more, he's financially very sophisticated. He understood, according to the charging documents in the U.S., how to set up shell companies and how to hide the identity of certain entities and to create that first level of obfuscations. People like Jolo and some other, individuals were able to construct an elaborate set of deceptions and shell companies that sounded just like real companies in order to, divert the money, launder it, cover it up, and make it appear as though everything was fine. Jolo was very smart about covering his tracks. One of the first things he did, right when 1MDB was getting up and running in 2009, Jolo basically established an account at a bank or a company in the Seychelles called Goodstar. After the deal was struck to invest in this joint venture with sign-off from the 1MDB board, a mysterious loan obligation appears that $700 million of the first $1 billion committed to this venture is going to go to pay back a loan from PetroSaudi. The U.S. government discovered that there was no such loan, but under the excuse that a $700 million loan had to be paid immediately out of the first $1 billion, a transfer took place from 1MDB's primary bank to, it was described it was going to go to PetroSaudi, but in fact it went to this small shell company called Goodstar. And the ownership was hidden. It was like one share, a bearer bond, that was owned by Jolo, but none of that was obvious. So he was smart enough to disguise that first transaction and have a cover story that Goodstar was actually the name of the venture. Perhaps the most famous example of Jolo's ability to disguise, hide, or obscure the source or the destination of the funds was an outfit that one of his colleagues came up with called Blackstone Asia Real Estate, which sounds remarkably like a very successful U.S. private equity firm, Blackstone, but it has nothing to do with the real Blackstone. It was just a shell company that used the name Blackstone to sort of give it a level of credibility. This happened over and over again, coming up with bogus names that sounded good or that sounded like or might be similar to, so that the banks who were unknowingly basically passing along money from one company to another wouldn't raise any obvious red flags.
Today, the Department of Justice has filed a civil complaint seeking to forfeit and recover more than $1 billion in assets associated with an international conspiracy to launder funds stolen from one Malaysia development barad, or 1 MDB.
What makes this such a potent and devastatingly successful theft, if you will, is basically he had the support of the government of Malaysia in the form of the Prime Minister.
If somebody has transgressed the law, then, they have to face the music.
The money spread around the world, and a great deal of it was laundered in the US.
You can see this extraordinary constellation of luxury properties and homes in Beverly Hills, in New York, and in London, famous pieces of art, luxury boats, gambling sprees in Las Vegas. So it's one thing for us to care about money being looted from people in countries around the world, but also when that money's coming to the US and coursing through our system, all this dirty money is a major cause of concern.
As pressure mounted on the Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, he was ousted from power in May 2018. The new Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, wins partly on a platform that calls for an investigation into the missing billions from 1MDB.
There are many charges that can be preferred against those involved.
Soon after the election, police raid properties linked to Mr. Najib and his wife, Rosma Mansour, and seize hundreds of boxes of luxury goods.
We have sealed the bags, but we know they contain money and we know they contain jewellery.
Police carted away 284 boxes containing luxury handbags and 72 bags stuffed with cash and jewellery.
The haul, which authorities later value at $273 million, includes 567 handbags, 423 watches, 234 pairs of sunglasses, and 14 tiaras. In amongst the trinkets was $29 million in cash. The couple maintained the luxury goods were gifts, and that the cash was political donations.
The country and the people suffer, and we must get hold of every cent that's been taken out from the country.
After facing trial for just some of the charges, Najib Razak has been sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined $50 million. He's appealing the decision.
What do you say to those who say that you've acted dishonestly about the funds? You've been called all sorts of things, including a thief. What's your response to that?
There's no evidence of that. I mean, you cannot just, accuse somebody.
But you have admitted that the funds did end up in your accounts, even though it was a donation from the Saudi government.
Yeah, it's been cleared. There's been no wrongdoing.
There is an appeal process in Malaysia, which is extremely lenient towards the rich and powerful, and which continues for years. And so therefore, Najib continues to walk free, and he indeed continues to vote in Parliament while his case is under appeal.
The 1MDB case is far from over. It's spread to all corners of the globe. Jolo is a fugitive, and there's plenty of money still missing. Not to mention the amount Malaysia is paying in interest on those original shady bond deals.
More than $11 billion of debt racked up in 5 years.
There are a lot of people, when you talk about it, their eyes just glaze over. It's numbers that we're talking about, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, financial concepts that not all people are familiar with.
Ultimately, when this type of thing happens, the people who benefit are just that cream at the top, the kleptocrats, and the people who lose, the people who remain impoverished, are the people who were nominally intended to benefit from the development of the oil wells or the mining concession or whatever.
The scandal has revealed just how easily money laundering can take place and how far corruption can reach. The complicity of the global financial system continues to be exposed.
The department filed criminal charges in New York against the Goldman Sachs Group and its Malaysian subsidiary, charging each with conspiracy to violate the anti-bribery provisions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Malaysia and Goldman agreed on a settlement of $3.9 billion.
Financial scandal after financial scandal involving big banks.
To be able to divert that much money from basically a government-sponsored enterprise and then use a network of global banks is just astounding.